For the last section in this chapter, we're going to talk about disorders of both childhood and of old age. So disorders that tend to be more common when you're very young and very old. So starting at the very young side of things, about 20% of children between the ages of 2 and 5 could be diagnosed with a disorder using the DSM. And in the study that was looking at this, about 50% of those that would be categorized as having a DSM disorder had symptoms that were considered severe enough to actually negatively impact. So that's a pretty huge number for children, especially that young. And despite this prevalence of the potential to diagnose young children with these disorders, we end up seeing that very few of them ever get proper treatment. Only about 40% of children with actual psychological disorders end up receiving professional attention. And that's in contrast to, say, children with physical handicaps, where children with physical handicaps, about 3/4 of them will ever receive professional treatment. So it's a lot more common to deal with a physical handicap than it is to deal with a mental or psychological disorder. This lack of treatment in situations where it's required can lead to undue stress on both the children and their families, and can lead to disorders that carry through childhood and into adulthood, so causing long-term effects that last throughout their lives. Of all of the childhood disorders that we tend to study in psychology, we're going to focus on 2 for this part of the chapter. And these 2 are attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, or ADHD, and autism, or fully autism spectrum disorder. So let's start talking about ADHD. And ADHD is typified by children having either inattention or hyperactivity and or impulsivity. And it could be a combination of inattention and hyperactivity and impulsivity, or it could be one or the other. And in terms of prevalence, up to 10% of North American children are thought to have this disorder. There is, of course, a genetic component to this disorder where if you have a child that has ADHD, other of your children are more likely to have ADHD than the general population. So the closer related you are to someone with ADHD, the more likely you are to also have it. Now, we don't tend to see any difference in brain function, so if you look at an MRI or any kind of functional brain scan, you don't tend to see any difference between a non-disordered individual and someone who has been diagnosed with ADHD. Now, they're not quite sure why this is happening, but they figure that maybe it is a disorder that is using so many different parts of the brain. It's a multifaceted disorder, that there's a lot of sort of interaction in different areas involved, and there's a complex interplay between sort of your physiological status and your environmental factors, which kind of sounds like a fancy way of them saying they're really not sure what's going on. But an interesting thing to note here is that that distinction between having a symptom of inattention inattention or the hyperactivity impulsivity is probably a really strong driving factor for the fact that young boys are a lot more likely to be diagnosed with ADHD than are girls. And the reason for this, at least they think, is because males tend to show up on the side of the spectrum where they have that hyperactivity or impulsivity. They can't sit still, they have to move around all the time, they're disruptive. And because that behavior is affecting others, there's a lot more drive to get a diagnosis. Whereas for females, they tend to show symptoms of inattention. So instead of acting out, they tend to sit quietly and not pay attention. So they're still having this deficit because of the disorder, but because it's not affecting others, they're a lot more likely to go undiagnosed because no one really realizes what's going on. So we do see that pretty dramatic difference in diagnosis where males are a lot more likely to be diagnosed than females. For the autism spectrum disorder, this disorder is characterized by individuals showing extreme unresponsiveness to others. They also tend to have poor communication skills, a lack of social responsiveness. Sometimes they'll display repetitive or stereotyped behaviors. Stereotyped just means that sort of these behaviors are repetitive and follow a particular pattern. And sometimes you'll see savant-like abilities. But I find that this trait, that savant abilities, is fairly popular in media, where you'll see on a TV show a child who's obsessed with trains and they can tell you all the facts about every train that's ever been made, or they have a fascination with airplanes or numbers or something. But it isn't always that extreme, and not all individuals with autism or that fall on the autism spectrum are going to display those abilities. So I like to kind of point out that discrepancy between representation in media and actuality. Autism affects about 1 in every 2,000 children, so it's common enough, but it's not overly common. So 1 in 2,000. Of those who are affected, most of them tend to be male, so about 80% are boys. And if we start looking at factors that are related to the development of this disorder, for the biological side of things, we tend to see a difference in brain mass. So the brains of those who have autism tend to be larger, so between 5 and 10% larger. And this difference in size shows up very early on. So this is seen as early as 18 months and tends to be prevalent up to about 4 years. There also seems to be evidence of accelerated pruning of neural connections during early development. So as their brains are developing, in normal development, we make lots and lots of connections, lots of neurons connecting to each other in our brains, and over time, as pathways are used and other pathways aren't used, those that aren't used get pruned. In individuals who are diagnosed with autism, that pruning tends to be a little bit more aggressive, and it happens a lot faster than it does in others. We also see some abnormal development in the cerebellum. And our cerebellum is involved in coordinating our movement and shifting our attention. So that might explain some of the behaviors that's seen with repetitive motions and inability to focus certain times. Now, for these areas, we're keeping it fairly vague, again, mostly because research isn't quite sure what's driving these behaviors. And different individuals who have been diagnosed with autism have a whole range of different symptoms that they display, different habits, different mannerisms. And that's why we've moved away from just a general diagnosis of autism to an autism spectrum disorder, because it is a spectrum of symptoms, hence the change in terminology. Related to biological bases, we do see quite a few genetic factors. And this is, again, a little bit of a gray area where there have been a couple of studies that have pointed to between 4 and 6 major genes that seem to be related to developing autism. Now, none of these genes are causal. There's not sort of an autism gene where if you have a particular mutation, you are guaranteed to develop autism. But there are a small number of genes that seem to be fairly directly related. And then there's quite a few more, between 20 and 30, that might be tangentially involved. Basically, all of this is telling us that there's potentially a polygenic involvement, where there's many, many genes involved, none of which are a direct causal influence. And this is also a good point to note that there is no credible scientific evidence of any link between autism and vaccinations. We'll move on from that. Now, if we want to shift from our disorders that affect the very young, we can talk about disorders that affect the elderly. And so one of the major ones and the main focus for the rest of this chapter is dementia in old age. So as we get older, we generally suffer a predictable loss of cognitive abilities. And that's to be expected with aging, but some individuals, as they get older, they experience more dramatic decline of cognitive abilities. And a lot of these developments of dementia, the ones that are more extreme, it seems to be associated with brain deterioration. So as they get older, their brain deteriorates more rapidly than is normal, and they display diseases such as Alzheimer's or Parkinson's or Huntington's, or I'm not even going to try and pronounce this one. So despite having all of these possible causes of dementia, we can also have general senile dementia, which is basically saying non-specific cause if dementia begins after the age of 65. So once you hit that sort of old age bracket, we can call it senile dementia to describe the gradual decline of cognitive abilities as you get older. And this tends to be seen in a 2-to-1 ratio, where females are much more likely to display that dementia than males. And in most cases, as long as it's not tied to one of these specific disorders that happens very aggressively, most senile dementia is going to have a gradual onset. So it tends not to be dramatic and intense. It tends to be a sort of slow decline as they get older. And actually, before I move on, we can talk about what some of those symptoms are. So individuals who are experiencing this senile dementia experience things like memory impairment, poor judgment, confusion, issues with language, or even feeling disoriented. And these can happen sort of slowly over time. Sometimes they pop up and go away, so they can be sporadic and unpredictable. And over time, some of these cases end up combining with depression, anxiety, agitation, paranoia, and disordered thinking. And if those things all combine in a certain way, it can start to look a little bit like schizophrenia, but it's sort of a complex interaction between old age and dementia and other factors that all come together. But we're going to talk about a couple of these causes. Actually, I think we're just going to focus on Alzheimer's because, again, time is short. But Alzheimer's disease is the leading cause of dementia in elderly adults. And so about 60% of individuals that have senile dementia have Alzheimer's disease, which is a massive, massive number of individuals. The current estimate is that approximately 500,000 Canadians have Alzheimer's or a closely related disorder. So again, massive amounts of people are affected by this. And so this decline is caused by a deterioration in the frontal and the temporal lobes. So those parts of the brain have reduced functioning. They show physical damage. So if you look at brain scans of individuals with Alzheimer's disease, you actually see reduced functioning and reduced structural integrity in both the frontal and temporal lobes. Another characteristic are what are called plaques, which are basically tangled lumps of neurons and patches of cell branches that are starting to disintegrate. So dense clusters of cells that are no longer functioning the way that they should be in the brain. And then the last key factor in this disease is that it tends to destroy cells that produce acetylcholine. And acetylcholine is a neurotransmitter that's directly involved in the neuroprocesses that underlie our memory. So, as those cells that produce acetylcholine are damaged and degraded, our ability to form and retrieve memories tends to decline as well. So, that's directly tying into the symptoms of Alzheimer's disease and the dementia that comes with it. And we're going to end anticlimactically because this slide is a mistake that doesn't actually have anything to do with the rest of the chapter. So we're done unexpectedly, and you can just ignore this slide.